On 23 March 1944, within the offices of the Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production in Berlin, a sealed dossier labeled Geheim, Nur Minister, Strictly Confidential, rested untouched on Albert Speer's polished desk. No one in the senior leadership yet understood that the documents inside it would overturn their remaining confidence in Germany's ability to continue the war. The compilation, prepared by what was left of German intelligence following the disbandment of the Abwehr, contained production data so extreme that Speer initially suspected a clerical mistake. The figures, however, were accurate. From the ministry windows, he could look down onto a city still absorbing the damage of the most recent Allied air raid. Work crews were clearing debris, while factories, despite Speer's well-known ability to boost output, struggled to maintain even the levels they had projected. German aircraft plants were expected to turn out approximately 39,800 planes in 1944, a number Speer had confidently delivered to Hitler only weeks before. Yet American production estimates told a radically different story. The United States, without including British or Soviet totals, was preparing to build around 96,000 aircraft, more than double Germany's output. But the report went beyond simple comparison. It included intercepted signals, intelligence summaries from neutral nations, and reconnaissance photographs, all of which revealed a conclusion the Nazi leadership had never seriously entertained. America was not pushing its industry to the breaking point to achieve these numbers. Instead, the United States was manufacturing aircraft while at the same time producing unprecedented quantities of ships, armored vehicles, trucks, and ammunition, an industrial capacity that far exceeded Germany's worst assumptions. The message was unavoidable. The decisive struggle of the war was unfolding not in the fields of Europe or the skies over Germany, but in the statistical columns of production charts. Even the most ideologically committed members of the regime would soon have to acknowledge that the Reich had entered an economic contest against a nation whose industrial scale it had fundamentally misunderstood. Speer himself had become legendary within Germany for his apparent ability to conjure output out of chaos. After the sudden death of Fritz Todt in a mysterious aircraft accident on 8 February 1942, Speer assumed control of the armaments program. Under his direction, overall war production tripled despite the intensifying Allied bombing campaign. Hitler celebrated him as a master of efficiency. Goebbels publicly praised him as the figure who had transformed impossibility into routine accomplishment. At only 39 years old, Speer was the Reich's youngest minister, an architect who had reinvented himself as the regime's chief technocrat. His reorganization of the war economy was radical for German standards. He instituted specialized single-shift production lines, aggressively standardized parts, and cut the number of aircraft types from dozens to only a handful of core designs. He seized authority from rival Nazi fiefdoms, trimmed administrative bottlenecks, and introduced mass production strategies inspired, ironically, by the American automobile factories he had studied during the 1920s. His reforms had given the illusion that German industry could keep pace.
The folder on his desk now showed how misguided that belief truly was. By the closing months of 1943, Speer believed he finally had solid grounds for optimism. German armament output, despite the relentless pounding of Allied bombers, had reached levels no one in Berlin would have imagined 2 years earlier. Ammunition factories were delivering nearly 5 times their 1940 volume. Tank assembly plants, reorganized and scattered across safer regions, were turning out 4 times as many armored vehicles as before. Aircraft production, once hampered by shortages and design bottlenecks, had multiplied roughly threefold. The Allied air campaign had indeed transformed German industrial centers into smoking ruins, yet the decentralized framework Speer had imposed ensured a steady flow of weapons and equipment to the Wehrmacht. To him, it was living proof that deliberate planning and strict managerial discipline could compensate for inferior resources. Then, at the beginning of 1944, the stream of intelligence reports reaching his desk began to challenge that confidence so sharply that even his closest associates were taken aback. The figures being relayed from foreign observers and military intercepts seemed detached from reality, so large that many officials dismissed them as Allied psychological warfare. Nazi propaganda had long portrayed the United States as an unserious, culturally decadent nation dominated by jazz, movies, racial confusion, and a supposedly inefficient democratic system. How could such a society, Speer wondered, possibly manufacture armaments at a scale surpassing not just Germany, but the entire Axis industrial base combined? The shock began in January 1944. Luftwaffe codebreakers intercepted production summaries the United States had transmitted to the Soviets as part of Lend-Lease documentation. General Adolf Galland, responsible for Germany's fighter arm, later recalled his discussions with Speer throughout that year as they tried to make sense of the numbers. According to these intercepts, American factories reported building 9,113 aircraft in December 1943 alone, a single month approaching Germany's total output for an entire quarter. At first, Speer refused to take the data seriously. He ordered his analysts to treat it as enemy exaggeration designed to depress German morale. But the dismissal didn't hold for long. Independent confirmations began arriving from unexpected directions. Neutral Swedish business agents, granted access to Detroit area manufacturers before the U.S. entered the war, quietly relayed photographs showing long, seemingly endless ranks of B-24 Liberators standing wingtip to wingtip at Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. One of the Swedish engineers who had toured the facility sent a meticulous description of the site.
A plant nearly 2/3 of a mile in length and a quarter mile across. By the spring of 1944, he wrote, workers there were completing a 4-engined bomber roughly every 63 minutes, operating in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. A simple calculation suggested that this single complex could deliver around 650 aircraft each month. Speer examined the photographs with a magnifier, moving slowly across the images. What struck him most was not only the number of finished planes, but the nature of the assembly process itself. The Germans were looking at a fundamentally different philosophy of industrial production, aircraft advancing on a moving line, past fixed stations staffed by specialized teams, an aviation adaptation of Henry Ford's automobile system. With the Armaments Ministry's technical intelligence units gradually absorbed into the SS in February 1944, Speer had to rely increasingly on indirect channels. Civilian economic analysts, remnants of military intelligence departments, and foreign commercial contacts became crucial. Swiss industrialists with ties to American subsidiaries forwarded excerpts from corporate financial reports. Spanish diplomats in Washington mailed copies of openly published U.S. newspapers that listed production totals without any attempt at secrecy. Portuguese shipping brokers described the staggering volume of American vessels passing through Atlantic ports. Perhaps the most valuable material came from Japanese naval attachés stationed in Berlin. Throughout 1944, they supplied information collected by Axis-aligned embassies in Argentina and Chile. Aircraft were pouring into South American training sites in such abundance that Brazil alone reportedly received up to 500 planes per month, used exclusively for instruction and pilot preparation. The Swedish contributions remained particularly detailed and numerically precise. Sweden's ball-bearing conglomerate SKF, which maintained factories in the United States, routinely sent neutral executives on inspection visits. These visitors, attempting to keep their country balanced between the warring powers, provided intelligence to both Germany and the Allies. One of their reports focused on the Pratt & Whitney engine plant in East Hartford, Connecticut. It described weekly production of 1,000 aircraft engines, non-stop test operations, and a workforce of around 40,000, including some 11,000 women. The report even noted the vast employee parking lots and estimated 15,000 vehicles belonging to the staff. In March 1944, Speer gathered these scattered reports on the long conference table in his Berlin office.
His chief deputy for fighter production, Karl Otto Sauer, stood beside him, running calculations again and again to ensure nothing had been misread. The numbers, outrageous as they first appeared, were becoming impossible to deny. The United States was producing aircraft, engines, and weapons on a scale that no German planner, however optimistic, had ever believed feasible.
Speer proposed that the figures coming from American industry might be embellished, perhaps inflated by half, to serve as psychological warfare. Yet even under that assumption, Sauer calculated that the United States would still be producing around 48,000 aircraft each year. That number alone exceeded Germany's total annual output. But the more intelligence analysts looked at the evidence, the clearer it became. The Americans were not exaggerating at all. Their own newspapers, which neutral nations could buy openly, printed production data without restriction. Major U.S. publications displayed astonishing transparency. The New York Times reported on Boeing's B-29 program without a single line redacted. Time magazine ran enthusiastic pieces about the Willow Run plant, complete with references to output rates. Life magazine went even further, publishing photographs of production floors where aircraft serial numbers were plainly visible, numbers that German intelligence could easily track. For the Germans, this openness was almost incomprehensible. At home, every detail related to armaments production was classified. Workers were required to sign oaths threatening severe punishment for disclosure. Factories were often disguised or deliberately misrepresented on maps. Meanwhile, the Americans were effectively broadcasting their industrial strength to the world. The dossier that German intelligence compiled on the Willow Run facility soon became essential reading for Speer and others seeking to understand the scale of American manufacturing. Built by the Ford Motor Company in 1941, Willow Run embodied an industrial philosophy completely alien to German practices. Its main building alone spanned roughly 3.5 million square feet, larger than the entire Messerschmitt complex in Augsburg. A Swedish engineer named Perot Jacobsen had been granted a tour of Willow Run in late 1943, and his technical report offered an unusually clear picture. According to Jacobsen, the plant employed about 42,000 people, over a third of whom were women. Unlike German aircraft factories where craftsmen moved from station to station assembling substantial portions of an airframe, Willow Run workers typically stayed in one position while the aircraft traveled along a motorized assembly line. Newly hired laborers required only about 3 weeks of training before joining production. By April 1944, the system was in full stride. 453 completed bombers in a span of 468 hours, averaging a finished B-24 every 63 minutes. Speer compared this output to Germany's own. Producing a single Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Luftwaffe's primary fighter, consumed around 4,000 labor hours. Skilled workers assembled large sections by hand, and training for new workers took half a year. Willow Run, by contrast, needed only about 1,225 labor hours for the final assembly of a B-24. Remarkably, despite the B-24 being a 4-engine aircraft weighing roughly 5 times more than a Bf-109, it demanded less than 1/3 of the labor hours. Throughout 1944, Speer attended regular briefings with Hitler at various headquarters. Every time he presented the newest American production estimates, the reaction was the same: dismissal, irritation, and accusations of spreading defeatism. In one meeting in May, Speer brought photographs of Willow Run and production figures sourced from neutral countries. Hitler glanced at them briefly before declaring that the information was fabricated. According to him, the Americans were attempting to deceive Germany with impossible claims. No country, he insisted, could manufacture aircraft the way automobiles were mass-produced.
Speer countered that this was exactly what the United States had achieved: the application of automotive mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. Hitler abruptly cut off the discussion, branding the reports as lies orchestrated by Roosevelt and Jews. But others in the leadership were no longer so sure. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the State Secretary of Aviation, quietly asked Speer whether the numbers were genuine. Speer answered that they were likely understated. Milch's response was bleak. If true, Germany had already lost the industrial contest. Back in Berlin, Speer conducted a meticulous evaluation of aircraft output using data later confirmed by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The numbers left little room for interpretation. Germany's peak production month in 1944, July, saw 4,219 aircraft completed. The high point for fighters came in September, with 3,375 units. Over the entire year, Germany produced 39,807 aircraft of all categories, roughly 25,285 fighters, 5,468 bombers, and 9,054 miscellaneous types. American statistics for the same year were staggering by comparison. The United States averaged roughly 8,000 aircraft per month, reaching an annual total of about 96,000. This included nearly 16,000 heavy four-engine bombers, around 35,000 fighters, and approximately 45,000 trainers, transports, and other models. But the raw totals told only part of the story. Each B-24 Liberator delivered a striking capacity comparable to two German medium bombers, yet required far less fuel, smaller crews, and lower maintenance per ton of explosives dropped. The qualitative efficiency of American aircraft magnified the already massive numerical gap. In every meaningful metric, volume, speed of production, labor efficiency, and operational output, the industrial power of the United States dwarfed that of the Third Reich. By the spring of 1944, a new layer of understanding had emerged within German intelligence circles, one that highlighted not battlefield tactics, but the overwhelming industrial depth of the United States. A steady flow of reports, some of them originating as far away as Argentina, painted a stark picture of American production strength. According to these assessments, the United States was turning out roughly 420,000 tons of aluminum each year, an amount that German factories, even with access to Norway's substantial hydroelectric facilities, could not hope to match. Germany's own annual output stalled at about 245,000 tons, revealing a gap that no amount of technical ingenuity could close. The comparisons became even grimmer when analysts examined energy production. American oil refineries were generating approximately 4.7 million barrels every single day, whereas Germany, cut off from major petroleum reserves and forced to rely on synthetic fuel derived from coal, managed the equivalent of only 124,000 barrels per day. One intelligence summary noted that the U.S. Army Air Forces expended more fuel in routine training than the Luftwaffe consumed in actual combat missions. Such figures were more than statistics. They reflected a fundamental imbalance in capacity.
Japanese military attachés stationed in Berlin offered their own candid interpretation. They observed that even when German submarines succeeded in sinking American tankers carrying 100,000 barrels of oil, the effect on U.S. operations was negligible. Washington did not ration or adjust strategy. It simply commissioned additional ships. As one Japanese observer remarked, the conflict for the Americans functioned less like traditional warfare and more like a form of industrial arithmetic, where losses were merely subtracted from an almost limitless supply. Beyond raw quantities, intelligence units were increasingly alarmed by the technological and manufacturing innovations emerging from across the Atlantic. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers conducted engine tests inside massive altitude chambers capable of reproducing conditions at 50,000 feet, far higher than anything Germany could simulate, with its best facilities reaching only 30,000 feet. Moreover, U.S. factories had widely adopted statistical quality control, using mathematical sampling methods to verify reliability instead of inspecting every individual part. This approach drastically accelerated output without sacrificing precision. Captured components from downed U.S. aircraft further underscored the disparity. Analyses of the Norden bomb site, retrieved from crashed American bombers, revealed an extraordinary degree of optical and mechanical sophistication, produced on a scale the German industrial system simply could not match. Dr. Ernst Heinkel reportedly told colleagues that German aviation remained rooted in craftsmanship, while the Americans had embraced a fully industrialized methodology. "We build machines like artisans," he lamented. "They build them with mathematics." American shipbuilding offered even more dramatic evidence of this industrial momentum. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 2,710 Liberty ships, an output that transformed the logistics of the war. Although the celebrated record-setting construction of the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in just over 4 days, was a publicity demonstration, the normal production schedule was astonishing in its own right, roughly 42 days from the laying of the keel to the vessel's launch. By 1943 and 1944, American yards were releasing ships at a rate that approached 3 vessels every 2 days during peak periods. U-boat commanders repeatedly reported convoys filled with these freighters, an unmistakable sign that the Allies could replace sunken ships far faster than Germany could destroy them. In May 1944, another set of intelligence reports intensified the sense of alarm. Swedish industrial representatives visiting American plants returned with detailed accounts of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The aircraft's specifications seemed almost unbelievable. A wingspan of over 141 feet, a maximum loaded weight of around 140,000 pounds, a 20,000-pound bomb capacity, a range of approximately 3,700 miles, pressurized crew compartments, and remotely operated defensive gun turrets. Production had begun the previous year, and it was estimated that nearly 4,000 B-29s would roll out of 4 separate manufacturing complexes. In contrast, Germany's most ambitious long-range bomber concept, the He-277, still existed only as a design on paper. When confronted with photographs and production data, Hermann Göring reportedly dismissed the program as impossible. Yet officers such as Adolf Galland, who had a clearer grasp of industrial realities, recognized the truth. As he later wrote, this was not an American bluff, but a demonstration of what a vast and highly organized manufacturing system could achieve.
Even the testimonies of captured American airmen unintentionally confirmed what German analysts already suspected. The United States was fighting with an industrial capacity so immense that traditional calculations of attrition and production no longer applied. The war had become, in many respects, a contest of economies, and in that contest, the outcome was already visible. Interrogations of captured personnel uncovered yet another critical weakness within the German war effort: pilot preparation. While American airmen typically logged between 250 and 400 training hours before ever facing an enemy aircraft, their German counterparts were entering combat with only a fraction of that experience. A typical American aviator progressed through a layered training regime, roughly 60 hours in primary flight instruction, 70 hours in basic aviation training, 50 to 75 hours in advanced schooling, and finally 75 to 170 hours transitioning to operational aircraft. By contrast, German fighter pilots in 1944 were being rushed to the front with an average of 112 hours, already reduced from the 160 hours that had been standard earlier that same year. The decline continued. In 1945, some new pilots arrived at operational units with barely 50 hours in the air. Fuel shortages had become so severe that many trainees never even touched the aircraft they were assigned until their first real combat sortie. One American prisoner, Technical Sergeant William Barnes, a B-17 crew chief captured after his bomber went down, offered a revealing perspective during questioning. He noted that although the U.S. was losing around 60 heavy bombers each month over Germany, production easily outpaced attrition. Boeing alone rolled out 140 new B-17s monthly, meaning the Americans often possessed more aircraft than they had trained crews to fly them. The scale of American industrial output became dramatically visible in June 1944 during the D-Day invasion.
Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 soldiers took part in the first wave alone. Despite this unprecedented display, Hitler insisted, incorrectly, that such an operation represented the upper limit of American capability. Those with access to broader intelligence, however, knew this was far from the truth. Reports arriving from Argentine sources emphasized just how prodigious U.S. shipbuilding had become. New Essex-class carriers were being launched at regular intervals, each one a vessel requiring 27,000 tons of steel and capable of carrying 90 to 100 aircraft. Germany, for its part, had only a single carrier hull, the Graf Zeppelin, still unfinished after 6 years of sporadic work. Economic intelligence delivered through Swiss intermediaries further highlighted the disparity. Dr. Karl Krah of IG Farben conveyed that the United States was producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, dwarfing Germany's 120,000-ton output. He summarized the contrast succinctly. The Americans had solved the bottleneck created by butadiene production and openly shared innovations across industries, whereas Germany's secrecy-driven approach stifled efficiency rather than enhancing it.
By July 1944, aerial reconnaissance over Detroit provided perhaps the most striking single image of American industrial concentration. The region's manufacturing zone surpassed the entire Ruhr Valley in density and scale. Analysts identified 1,600 acres at Willow Run, 2,000 acres at the Ford River Rouge complex, 1,100 acres at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, and more than 5,000 combined acres of General Motors factories. The photos revealed hundreds of sprawling buildings, thousands of cars parked around them, and rail networks capable of handling over 1,000 freight cars per day. In August 1944, Germany reached its peak aircraft production, but the moment coincided with Albert Speer's final acceptance that the war could no longer be won. A detailed intelligence report compared American and German output for the first half of that year. The figures told the story plainly. United States, January to June 1944, 48,000 aircraft, projected 96,000 for the year, about 14,000 tanks, over 300,000 military trucks, hundreds of naval vessels, and 5.75 million tons of merchant shipping. Germany, same period, 19,800 aircraft, 9,700 tanks and assault guns, 47,000 military trucks, 193 U-boats, and effectively no merchant shipping. American industrial momentum continued accelerating, while German production, assaulted by strategic bombing, began its slow collapse. Fuel output plummeted under the oil campaign, and transportation networks clogged so badly that completed weapons often sat idle in factories, unable to move to frontline units. By late 1944, fragments of intelligence hinted at a vast scientific effort whose purpose remained obscure, but whose scale could not be overlooked. Although the atomic nature of the Manhattan Project was still hidden, reports described gargantuan facilities devouring electrical power. The complex at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, according to German estimates, consumed 1/7 of the entire electrical output of the United States, with peak demands reaching 298,800 kilowatts. To Speer, it appeared the Americans were allocating resources equivalent to Germany's entire V-weapon program, but focusing it all on a single mysterious undertaking. Analysts in September 1944 concluded that the gap separating German and American production extended far beyond quantitative differences. It was rooted in their philosophies. U.S. factories prioritized standardization, interchangeable components, streamlined designs, statistical quality control, and workers trained for specialized roles. Germany prized intricate engineering, custom-made parts varying by manufacturer, artisan-level craftsmanship, and workers capable of performing many different tasks. As Speer later remarked, "We crafted aircraft as engineering masterpieces. They built them as mass-produced tools." Germany might field a technologically superior jet fighter, like the Me-262, but could only turn out 20 of them each month. American industry, he observed,
would have re-engineered the aircraft for high-volume production and likely manufactured 10 times that number. By November 1944, even Hermann Göring could no longer dismiss the overwhelming dominance of American industry. The evidence had become impossible to deny.
The engagement in the Leyte Gulf marked more than a strategic turning point. It offered the clearest demonstration of the scale and momentum of American wartime industry. The United States Navy sent into battle a force so vast that the number of aircraft carriers alone exceeded the total quantity of destroyers fielded by Germany throughout the war. Around the same period, during a Luftwaffe leadership conference, Adolf Galland presented figures that stunned even the officers accustomed to bad news. He explained that American fighter strength over German territory had reached a ratio of roughly 15-to-1. U.S. pilots arrived in Europe with training programs that delivered around 400 flight hours, while newly minted German pilots often entered combat with barely 50. The contrast extended to machinery as well. American aircraft engines remained reliable for about 400 operational hours before requiring major maintenance, whereas the German engines typically endured only a few dozen hours. Galland summarized the problem with a brutal clarity. We are not contending with a single opponent. We are fighting against multiple air forces simultaneously. He pointed out that the U.S. 8th Air Force by itself deployed roughly 3,000 heavy bombers, an individual unit that surpassed the total combined strength of the entire Luftwaffe. The winter offensive of December 1944, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, delivered the final undeniable evidence of this imbalance. Even though the Germans achieved total tactical surprise at the outset, the American counter-mobilization was so rapid and so massive that the breakthrough could not be sustained. Within mere days, the U.S. Army had shifted 250,000 soldiers, 50,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies toward the threatened sector. Captured American depots left German commanders speechless. Single storage sites held more materiel than some German divisions controlled during entire campaigns. By January 1945, Albert Speer compiled what was likely his most far-reaching analysis of the industrial situation. Through Swiss banking intermediaries, he had obtained American war bond advertisements, public consumer propaganda openly listing U.S. production totals. Figures that would have been classified at the highest level inside Germany were being printed in magazines to encourage American citizens to buy bonds. These advertisements boasted that between 1940 and 1945, the United States had manufactured 300,317 aircraft, 86,000 armored vehicles, 2.6 million trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, and 2,710 Liberty-class cargo ships. On January 30th, the anniversary of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Speer attended what would become his final serious attempt to persuade Hitler to accept negotiated terms. He warned bluntly, "My Führer, we must recognize the truth. The Americans accomplish in a single month what takes us an entire year." Hitler rejected the assessment, insisting that wars were settled by determination and spirit rather than by material arithmetic, an argument that revealed just how far removed he had become from material reality. In mid-March 1945, with the situation deteriorating rapidly, Speer submitted a written memorandum predicting that Germany's economy would collapse entirely within 4 to 8 weeks. The following day, Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree, instructing that all German infrastructure capable of supporting the enemy should be destroyed. Speer responded on March 29th with another memorandum opposing such destruction. He stressed that Allied production capacity had reached such a magnitude that any damage inflicted by retreating German forces would be replaced by the Americans in a matter of weeks, while Germany would require decades for recovery. Hitler denounced him for defeatism and treachery, though by this stage, Speer understood that the decision-making apparatus was collapsing. He later recalled that by mid-1944, the production data had already convinced him that Germany's defeat was inevitable.
As U.S. troops closed in on Berlin in April 1945, intelligence officers continued to gather documents that highlighted American industrial mobilization. One such capture, a copy of Fortune magazine, detailed how the American automobile sector, which had produced nearly 5 million civilian vehicles in 1941, had fully redirected its capacity toward military manufacturing. That industry alone had turned out millions of military trucks, tens of thousands of tanks, and a vast number of aircraft. By the final weeks of the Third Reich, the numbers told a story no ideology could counter. Verified U.S. production totals stood at roughly 300,317 military aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, 639,000 jeeps, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.66 million machine guns, and 6,500 naval vessels, including 2,710 Liberty ships. In contrast, German wartime output from 1939 to 1945 amounted to around 95,000 aircraft, 63,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, 345,000 trucks, 61,000 artillery pieces, about 1.22 million machine guns, and 1,171 U-boats. The production ratios were staggering, more than 3-to-1 in aircraft, nearly 8-to-1 in trucks, and measurable advantages even in categories where Germany had produced for a longer span. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed that German intelligence had significantly underestimated American output. For example, German analysts predicted U.S. aircraft production for 1944 would amount to just over 22,000 planes. The real figure exceeded 96,000, an error of more than threefold. Although Speer's memoir, Inside the Third Reich, concentrated largely on his personal role and his complex relationship with Hitler, subsequent interrogations and interviews made it clear that he fully recognized the decisive impact of American industrial power. In the end, it was not merely battlefield defeats, but the sheer weight of production, documented in publicly available statistics, that signaled the irreversible downfall of Nazi Germany.
In an interview given decades after the war, he recalled a turning point in his thinking. By the first months of 1944, the outcome was already obvious. Germany could no longer close the gap. The United States turned out 96,000 aircraft that year, not as an extraordinary push, but as a level of production they could have maintained for as long as necessary. Other senior figures in the Third Reich later admitted they reached similar conclusions. Field Marshal Erhard Milch stated during post-war testimony that the moment he learned the United States had manufactured 9,000 aircraft in a single month, he realized Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. Admiral Karl Donitz confessed that when his intelligence officers reported how quickly the Americans were launching escort carriers, faster than German shipyards could complete new U-boats, he understood the Battle of the Atlantic had slipped out of Germany's control. General Adolf Galland wrote that every American pilot lost over Europe was replaced almost immediately, often by someone with superior training, creating what he described as an unstoppable wave rather than a conventional adversary. Technological momentum amplified American numerical dominance. The proximity fuse, for example, multiplied the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire several-fold. The United States produced roughly 22 million of these devices, whereas Germany never managed to develop or mass-produce a comparable system. Radar tells a similar story. American laboratories pursued multiple designs simultaneously, then manufactured thousands of units in standardized form. German radar systems, by contrast, remained largely artisanal, constructed in limited quantities with fragmented industrial support. And the turbocharger, essential for high-altitude performance, became another dividing line. General Electric built hundreds of thousands of them during the conflict,
while German attempts to reverse engineer captured examples faltered due to metallurgical limitations and the inability to scale production effectively. Ultimately, the economic imbalance dwarfed every tactical success Germany achieved. In 1944, the United States produced a gross national product of approximately $210 billion compared to Germany's roughly $45 billion. Even though Germany directed a greater proportion of its economy toward military purposes, American war output still exceeded the total value of German production. Historians later noted that the United States could absorb losses equivalent to the entirety of Germany's yearly output in a single major campaign and still continue fighting without endangering its economy. Waste, misallocation, or battlefield disasters that would have shattered the German system amounted to temporary setbacks for the Americans. Training followed the same pattern. Over the course of the conflict, the United States trained about 435,000 pilots. Germany, under immense pressure and constant fuel shortages, managed no more than about 57,000. By 1945, many newly deployed German flyers had never fired their weapons in practice before being thrown into combat. Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff later admitted that they were effectively sending adolescents against professionals, an arrangement he described not as warfare, but as a form of slaughter. The German leadership's psychological response to the widening production gulf evolved in stages that many historians now consider predictable: denial in the early years, rationalization as the numbers grew worse, followed by frantic attempts to reverse the tide, delusional reliance on miracle weapons, and finally, a grim acceptance of reality. These shifts shaped strategy itself, contributing to increasingly reckless decisions that accelerated Germany's collapse.
The irony, which became clearer in retrospect, was that American industrial strength relied on social dynamics the Nazi regime dismissed as weaknesses. A racially mixed workforce and unprecedented participation by women made U.S. factories more productive than any system built on enforced labor or ideological hierarchy. What the Third Reich imagined as inherent superiority proved far less efficient than the flexible, decentralized, and incentive-driven organization found in American industry. In his later reflections, Speer acknowledged that Germany's fundamental error was believing military prowess and ideological fervor could compensate for insufficient industrial capacity. The leadership convinced itself that determination and technical skill would overcome material disadvantage. Every one of those assumptions, he concluded, collapsed when confronted with the United States' ability to produce aircraft in quantities that Germany could not hope to match. The 96,000 American aircraft produced in 1944 symbolized more than output. They represented an industrial engine operating at a scale no totalitarian state could reach. At Willow Run, a B-24 Liberator emerged from the assembly line roughly every hour, a pace that demonstrated not just efficiency, but a new paradigm of mass production. The war for material supremacy had been decided long before the fighting ended. The rapid conversion of American consumer industries into wartime manufacturing power constituted perhaps the largest coordinated industrial effort in human history. Against such capacity, the Third Reich's ambitions faltered. When Speer grasped the scale of American production, he recognized that Germany had already lost, not because of any battlefield defeat, but because it was competing against a nation whose industrial potential made every German victory temporary. Ultimately, the war underscored a broader truth. In modern conflict, industrial capability functions as strategy. Logistics shapes tactics, and production determines the fate of nations. The United States understood this from the outset. Germany understood it only when the situation was beyond salvage. The aircraft built in 1944 were far more than machines of war. They were the tangible expression of a democratic industrial system whose power rendered authoritarian dreams untenable.